So let's open it up for questions. Please identify yourself and no comments, questions, so we can get as many people involved as possible. At the back, please.
Typically, we hear when it comes to the Middle East that roots of all problem Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This time you did not mention this. Your comments, please.
I actually said that in the dignity question. If you had, in reference to dignity, that was a core part of the dignity question. I happen to think two things about the Palestine-Israeli question in this regard. Arab attitudes toward the outside world, particularly toward the U.S., are mostly formed through the prism of the Israel-Palestine question. So whatever the U.S. does or doesn't do, in the end, the ultimate evaluation of American foreign policy is seen through the prism of what the U.S. does or doesn't do on the Israel-Palestine question. We asked a lot of questions in the poll about that. When I asked them, what is it about the Obama administration, what issue in the Obama administration policy in the past year that you dislike most? The number one issue is the Israel-Palestine question. When you ask them, what do you think drives American policy in the Middle East? The two top issues they say is protecting Israel and oil, protecting oil. When you look at their attitudes in terms of who are their heroes over the past decade, they all have to do with leaders who took a position that was pro-Palestinian and against American foreign policy, from Hassan Nasrallah to Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to Hugo Chavez to even Erdogan himself. His rise in the polls in the Arab world only happened in 2009, right after the Gaza flotilla. He was not that high up in 2008 or 2007. Jacques Chirac of France was #1 in 2005 after he had hosted Yasser Arafat in his when he was dying and so forth. There is no question in my mind that at least the Arab public sees the world through the prism of the Palestine-Israel question. That's number one. Number two, that from all our polling, the public in the Arab world is far angrier with Israel than the governments have been. And in some ways, the governments have served to mute public anger with Israel, particularly in Egypt, And that buffer of protection that existed is no longer there. It doesn't matter who gets elected. Now you're going to see more of that coming up to the surface, and governments will have more limited mobility. And number three, while the revolutions in the Arab world were not fueled directly by the Israel-Palestine question, that issue of humiliation that is, that is pervasive in the Arab world, that pursuit of dignity is not about just individual dignity, it's collective dignity, both for Arabs and separate countries, is linked to the view of their governments being subversive to the outside world and accepting humiliation. And the Palestine question has always served as the identity question for most Arabs and a symbol of that collective humiliation. So yes, that issue is very important, even though it's not the direct fueling issue, it was not the chant that was generated in Tunis or in Cairo, but don't underestimate how important it is and how more important it's going to become.
Can you wait for the microphone, please?
My name is Rob Latin. I'm a blogger for the Israel blog for Foreign Policy Association. What do you think if there was an attack on the Iranian nuclear facility, either by the United States or by Israel, especially given now there's a whole cyber warfare going on between Israel and some of the Arab hackers? What's the effect going to be like on the future of the Arab Spring and Israel and United States relations, etc.?
Okay, that's a good question. By the way, I had an op-ed in the New York Times last week on this issue of Iran's nuclear program, in which I basically opposed the military option as not being a sensible one. But I also revealed public opinion polls among Jewish Israelis that I released that showed that surprisingly 2/3 of Israelis are open to a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East that includes Israel ultimately giving up its nuclear facilities and opening up for inspection if in fact it is a regional that includes Iran and the Arabs. So very interesting finding within Israel itself. Let me just tell you how Arabs see Iran and then think backward. And this is separate from the consequences of war militarily, because we know that's, another arena. But thinking about just in terms of public opinion for now. By and large, Arabs don't love Iran. And that is not the issue. But what has happened over the past decade is that Iran has become something of an enemy of my enemy, particularly in the time when their governments were seen not to be able to stand up, quote, to Israel and the U.S. And that's where the anger is. So when I asked them, first of all, name the 2 countries that are most threatening to you. I asked an open question to Arabs in these 6 countries, including Saudi Arabia. The number 1, by far, is Israel. The number 2, by far, is the United States of America. And we're talking about like 80% and 70% saying Israel and the United States. And Iran, only about 12%, 14%, 10% for year to year. So Iran is seen to be a considerably lesser threat than Israel and the U.S. That's number 1. And that's part of the problem. Second, when you ask them, do you think Iran is trying to acquire nuclear weapons? Actually, majority say yes. So they're not buying Iran's argument they're not building nuclear weapons. They say, yeah, they're building nuclear weapons. Then you ask them, well, should the international community pressure them to stop their nuclear weapons or not? The majority say, no, it shouldn't stop. They shouldn't pressure them to stop. And that doesn't only include Saudis and Egyptians and Jordanians, but it includes even Arab citizens of Israel in a poll that I conducted internally. And that's what I call the double standards argument. People see it as a double standard argument. Therefore, if you're going after them, why are you singling out a Muslim country? Even if I don't like it, why are you singling it out? What about Israel? And so that's part of the dynamic of what's going on with Arab public opinion. I don't think people will rally behind Iran for love. They rallied behind Hassan Nasrallah despite the Sunni-Shia divide, because they saw him as being able to stand up to Israel and the U.S., particularly in the 2006 war. And he was the number 1 most popular in places that have Sunni majorities, like Egypt and Morocco and even Jordan. And even among Israel, again, Arab citizens of Israel, he's the number 1. He was the number 1 most popular, including those who got hit by his rockets from Lebanon. So it just tells you something about when I say this dignity question. It trumps almost the Sunni-Shia divide. It trumps even the dislike of Iran that they rally behind it. That's separate, of course, from Arab governments' reaction. I mean, some Arab governments would like to see Iran put in its, in sort of more contained, and even some might be more open to military attacks. Some don't, but the public is somewhere else.
Boy, I feel like I'm getting a PhD in Middle Eastern relations. Please.
My question is,
Please identify yourself before.
my name is Ziv Kaufman. My question is, do you think that Saudi Arabia or some other Gulf countries support Islamist groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood and also Ennahda in Tunisia? And if so, what is the interest of those Gulf states to support these these Islamist movements?
It's kind of interesting how this is going to unfold. It's going to vary from country to country, and certainly the big question is about Saudi Arabia because it has the biggest capacity and obviously politically it has weight. The Saudis have, in some ways, first reacted by trying to buffer their own public and then tried to create a regional club. Some people call it the Monarchy Club because they have the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council states that are made up of all the Gulf monarchies. And then they invited Jordan and Morocco to come there to expand that club, to create more of a regional alliance of sorts. And the medias have converged a little bit in the coverage of the Arab Street, and then they've reached out to Egypt because they understand that the outcome in Egypt is going to matter for how everything else unfolds, by in essence providing economic aid to Egypt as a way of maintaining goodwill with the Egyptian public and also maintaining a good relationship with the Egyptian military. That's how they managed it. Historically, since people think of them as an Islamic country, as a leader of Islam, that they would, I would think, at some level, seem a bit pleased that the Egyptian public and the Tunisian public is projecting Islamic identity because they've created links with them. At another level, they don't want them to get out of control. So they want to keep checks on them. So it's going to be very difficult. What we've seen in Egypt particularly is not just the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, which has gained almost half of the vote. That was not entirely shocking. I think everybody understood the Muslim Brotherhood was going to do best. The most surprising aspect was really the rise of the Salafis, who had gained more than a quarter of the vote, and they appeared to be under the radar screen. And that's actually a more conservative group, and much of the financing for that group actually has come from Saudi Arabia. In fact, part of the reason why this group has been under the radar screen is not just that there was getting money from Saudi Arabia and being sort of cushioned a little bit, but that the Egyptian intelligence services appear to have given them space to operate with a tacit agreement that they don't interfere in politics and keep their head low, while they would give them space to operate as a way of providing opposition to the Muslim Brotherhood, which they feared more politically. And when that whole umbrella basically was removed, they raised their heads in a fashion that no one really expected. How they behave and where the Saudis come on that is really an open question. I think they're going to be scratching their head and trying to figure out what to do.
In the interest of time, if that's all right, Professor, I'll try and take 2 or 3 questions and we'll combine them. So let's take one way at the back, and then that gentleman here, and the third one right there. So way at the back.
Hi, Roger.
Hi, Roger. Listen.
It's a cell phone. Turn off your cell phone.
With regards to the sentiments of the proposal that you did regarding terrorists in that region, what's your assessment as to Assad's claim that the linkages, and again Gaddafi's claim that the linkages with Al-Qaeda? How does that resonate in the population?
Okay.
Connections with Al-Qaeda. Let me take the second question right there.
Yes, you gave a very general response to the basic inquiry here about what's the likely consequence of these revolutionary rather than evolutionary events. But the very specific question is, where do you see Syria and Egypt in a year or 2 years on the central dimensions of how are they going to stand vis-a-vis Iran? How are they going to stand vis-a-vis Israel and the U.S.? How are they going to stand in terms of internal civil war or more cohesive kind of development? And I think it's those questions that are on everybody's mind, and that your thoughts from your experience would be most appreciated.
One more, the third one. We need a microphone right in the center row, please. Right behind you.
It's been asked already. I was going to ask about the Cuban presidency, but it's not about the previous president.
Okay. So, quick question.
Thank you, Professor Telhami. My name is Abadi. I'm former official of the UN, now UN correspondent. I was interested in what you said. Arab dignity has always existed. It's not born in 2010 or 2011. What gave it free expression? Presumably the internet. The internet, does that explain the fact that the leadership of the Arab awakening is youth? And if that's the case, we have similar situation with the internet in Africa. Why doesn't it give rise to similar awakening in Africa? Thank you.
Sure. Okay, let me start with that question about the narrative. You know, when Gaddafi says it's Al-Qaeda, we obviously cannot do reliable polls in Syria right now, and I don't. So what I'm going to give you is what the rest of the Arab world thinks about the events in Syria. I have two questions that are relevant for that. One question is, do you believe that the current uprisings in the Arab world are about people, ordinary people seeking freedom and dignity, B, about opposition groups seeking power, or C, about foreign powers trying to create trouble in the Arab world? The overwhelming majority say it's A. It's about ordinary people seeking freedom and democracy, and that's true in every country. When I ask them in Syria, do you sympathize more with the rebels or with the government? I have 86%, I believe, say they sympathize with the rebels, and roughly about 10% say with the government. That is the aggregate from these countries. In Lebanon, it's more divided. We have half and half, actually. The Lebanese are more divided, more along sectarian lines. While the question isn't specific to what is Al-Qaeda, you can get from that basically an answer that I don't think Al-Qaeda is a big factor in all this now. I actually, when Mubarak fell exactly a year ago, I had on January 25th, 2011, an article that I wrote immediately after Mubarak fell. Was published right away on Politico Online, and the title of the article was Bin Laden's Nightmare in Egypt, in the sense that I saw that the success of these popular, non-ideologically driven, mostly peaceful revolution would be essentially rendering Al-Qaeda even more irrelevant than it had become prior to these revolutions. I think that's pretty much true. Now, in terms of predicting, that's the thing about the revolutions. I think anybody who would dare predict is a fool, and I'm not a fool. I could tell you things that I'm watching for. That's all I could tell you. In Egypt, I have to say I'm probably more optimistic than most. I think anybody who expected that there would be a rapid, wonderful, beautiful, liberal transition to democracy, I think has not studied revolutions. I mean, this is going to take a long time, and for now, by and large, it's been mostly peaceful. There's been obviously some unfortunate events, and yes, the Islamists have won, but they've been mostly the mainstream Muslim Brotherhood, which has not been militant, and yes, it has a conservative social agenda, but they've also sent different signals about moderation. My worry actually about the Muslim Brotherhood is whether they would be intoxicated by power and would agree to a deal with the military where they share power, which is obviously something that is happening at the expense of an evolving democratic process. What I'm watching for is not so much who's going to win the presidency in the spring election. That's going to be important and consequential, but what will happen particularly with the Constitution. The writing of the Constitution is the most important thing ultimately for the long term for Egypt. I'm not comfortable with the first elected parliament writing a constitution. That is not, in my judgment, a source of comfort. That is not, because it's not a mature democracy yet. You've got a fluid situation where people might be inclined to impose ideas without as much reflection. It's hard to know, but that's the thing I would watch for. The second thing is the economy. Yes, I think in the short term, Egyptian economy is in difficult shape. This could become even worse as we move forward, and that could have a backlash. Those are the two things that I'm watching for more than anything else. The third one is what happened on the Israel-Palestine question. Everything being equal, no one in Egypt is going to be pushing for a strained relationship with Israel, not even the Muslim Brotherhood. They just don't want that to disrupt their internal agenda. But if there is fighting between Gaza, between Hamas and Israel, there is no doubt that they no longer can provide the kind of umbrella that the Mubarak regime did, and it'll push them in a different direction. And so they're all praying that there will not be an explosion, because if there is one, it'll disrupt the process. Syria is even more difficult to predict, because when I look at Syria, I see seeds of civil war. I worry about that a lot, because civil wars are never pretty, and there are a lot of people lose their lives separately from who might win or lose. And I see in the Assad regime's longevity not merely a military machinery, because you have to ask the question, why does a military machinery maintain coherence? Why do people, look at what happened with the Shah, the first sign of trouble, a lot of people in the military left and joined revolutionaries. So why doesn't that happen on the same scale with Syria? If you look at the type of demonstrations that we witnessed in Syria, there were a lot, and there was a lot of opposition, and unfortunately so much killing and destruction. But the regime has had very significant demonstrations in its favor, particularly in the two most populous cities in Syria, Aleppo and Damascus. How much of that is fear of the alternative, or how much of it is an embrace of the regime, is hard to tell. And that's going to be the key question. Are people going to be prepared to die for Assad, or are they for now prepared to sort of just be passive? We're going to be watching that game as the story unfolds. You asked me a question I cannot answer. So it's too difficult for me to think about.
Well, with that, I want to thank you on behalf of the FPA. This has been a most magnificent evening, and you've really helped us understand. And please join us for the reception. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.